Well then, let's talk about malaria. So this is going to be the last video and the last part of lecture 5. Malaria is a huge problem across the world because it is very common. Lots of people get infected, and it can range from annoying to fatal. And treatments for it are not as easy to get as treatments for other things. So let's get into it. There are many different species that can cause malaria, but they all have the same genus. They're all from Plasmodium, and they're all from this big phylum. The different species cause different forms of the disease, and one of them is by far the most dangerous. Falciparum is the one that causes most of the fatalities. The last time I was gathering a lot of data on this was back in 2012, and not much has changed since then. Roughly 200 million known symptomatic infections across the world, and 500,000 deaths worldwide. These numbers do fluctuate from year to year, but they're huge numbers, and so this is a thing that needs to be changed. We don't see it much in the US. It's rare in the US, although it was common in the US in the 1700s, and it could become common again. But most of the serious cases are in sub-Saharan Africa, where falciparum is endemic. There are outbreaks in the US because people bring it back from regions where it's endemic, and they can get bitten by the mosquitoes that spread it, but it's not common at all. The mosquitoes that spread it are Anopheles. These are not the beautiful ones that spread the viruses like Zika, dengue, and yellow fever. These are ugly mosquitoes that spread a horrible fatal disease, malaria. And again, many different species of the Anopheles mosquitoes are capable of spreading malaria. And those, many of them are still present in the US. So if you travel around certain parts of the East Coast, you'll find wetlands with channels cut in them, which I discovered as I was exploring them in my pack raft many years ago. And those were cut in the 1930s to drain the wetlands, to cut down on mosquito populations, to make sure that things like yellow fever and malaria didn't spread as much as it used to. And that is the case. They don't. Let's see. So a mosquito will bite a person, and they'll go through an incubation period, and then they'll have a recurring fever cycle where they'll go back and forth between this state, which is intense cold, chattering teeth, and the shiver, and a high fever, back and forth between those two. And then they'll break that fever, go through massive perspiration, and then they will pass out. And you'll understand this statement in a few minutes. So what can happen is damage to a lot of internal organs, and ultimately internal bleeding and failure of internal organs. And most of the time, the severe symptoms and signs happen in children under 5 years old who are exposed to Plasmodium falciparum. So different species cause the fever and chills to recur in different intervals. So falciparum causes a fever that never really goes away, but others cause a 72-hour cycle, and two species make a strange form that causes chronic liver infection, and they will get a relapsing disease every few years. Apicomplexan refers to the facts that they cycle through proteins on their surfaces. So these cells can put different proteins on their surfaces to evade immune responses. They can cycle through 150 different ones. And so that is why it's such an effective pathogen that can easily sicken a healthy person or a healthy adult. This is where we find the Anopheles mosquitoes. It's color-coded by the species. And so all along here on the coast of the US, we do have an Anopheles species that could potentially spread malaria if several people in your neighborhood were infected at the same time, at a time when mosquitoes were abundant. That's what it is. A different species, A different species is endemic to where I used to live, all over this part of the world. And it's a little bit complicated because mosquitoes, different mosquitoes will appear at different time depending on how much rain has fallen and what the temperatures are. So it's hard, we can't predict that without knowing things about the mosquitoes. Just be aware that you might see malaria, especially as the whole world heats up over the next 10 to 50 to 100 years. The climates will change and we'll see more tropical conditions. So I want to show you the life stages of this bizarre protist so that I can show you the disease cycle and what's happening in a human body. So what we need to think about is, well, the sporozoites, this is important, merozoites, gametocytes, and oocysts. Those are the main forms. We can kind of skip this one. So let's just put this all out here. The first thing that happens, the sporozoite form is the one in mosquito saliva. So they're in the mosquito salivary gland, and when the mosquito bites, it injects an anticoagulant to help the blood flow, and that carries with it the sporozoites. They become merozoites in liver cells, and then they are released in the bloodstream where they infect red blood cells and then rupture the red blood cells and infect other red blood cells. While they're in, imagine what would happen if 30% of your red blood cells lysed. This is what can happen during a serious case of malaria. If a large number of your red blood cells lysed, you'd have clotting problems, you'd have inappropriate clotting in small venules. So in every internal organ, just after a capillary bed, you'd see a clot. And so this can lead to hemorrhaging, and it can lead to disrupted blood supply, and that can lead to organ failure. So anyway, eventually gametocytes form, and you can probably see from that word gamete, this has to do with sexual reproduction. And that's the form that will infect the mosquito when it bites the person. And then in the mosquito, it'll go through further development, migrate to the salivary gland, and become sporozoites. And this is all of that. So I don't expect you to memorize all of this, although the more detail you get, the better you'll understand and the easier it will be to remember. What you absolutely must know is that the cycle of fever happens as red blood cells are lysed and reinfected. You absolutely must know that the infection of the mosquito salivary gland is what allows it to inject us with plasmodium. Mosquitoes don't care about malaria. They don't benefit in any way from getting us malaria. But it is the fact that the protist infects their salivary gland that allows them to do this. So that is important. And you should be able to describe the things I've been saying. Treatments for malaria have been known for a long time, because malaria has been known for a long time. Quinine, which you may experience if you drink tonic water. It's incredibly bitter and disgusting. It is actually an effective treatment against some species of malaria. And in fact, it's still used during severe cases of malaria all over the world. Chloroquine is a more modern analog of quinine, but it doesn't seem to have much of an effect against falciparum, against Plasmodium falciparum. So we need other drugs. For example, this one, I'm not sure how to pronounce, can attack the hypnozoites in the liver. And again, it's only 2 different species that make those hypnozoites that cause a chronic infection, but this is a drug that can treat that chronic infection. And then we have drugs that are derived from artemisinin, like artemether. Combined with quinine, this is the best treatment for falciparum. It's extracted from a slow-growing shrub. So chemists are trying to figure out how to make these things so that they can make them in huge quantities and not have to extract them from slow-growing shrubs. Because if it were cheap to make this, they could send it all over the world, and everyone would have access to it, which is not currently the case. There are a lot of other drugs for malaria, but they don't all work against the worst strain. And let's see, what else? Right. Vaccines against malaria haven't had a lot of success, partly because of those 150 different surface proteins. So it's hard to figure out what would go into a vaccine. If you have a vaccine with 150 different proteins in it, you're going to get really weak activation against 150 different proteins and probably none. So vaccines we don't have. The best prevention for malaria is anything that can prevent mosquito bites. So that's everything from mosquito nets around beds, so a person can sleep without being bitten, to insecticides that you can spray in a wetland to kill mosquitoes, to mosquitoes that can't transmit malaria. People are trying to breed these and release them into the wild. Because we would accept Anopheles mosquitoes biting us if they wouldn't give us malaria. And there are other high-tech weird things we're doing against malaria that you can read about. Okay, you have survived lecture 5. This is it. So good job. And again, become as familiar as you can with all of these diseases. The more you memorize about each disease, the faster you will be able to come up with the right answer when you take the exam. When it comes to something like malaria, I want you to know a lot more about it. So every slide about malaria had information that I want you to remember. And if you paid attention to what I was saying when those slides were showing, you know pretty much exactly what I care about. And it's also written on the slide. So good luck with that, and I will see you soon.